Ever since my brother first showed me this short clip of Made in Abyss about 4 years ago or so, it's always been on my mind. Now, with the recently released video game and second season of the anime, I finally decided to check this out for myself, and this was a hell of a ride. I quickly became a fan as the unique world and great characters drew me in. I'd have to think about it more. It's probably not one of my all-time favorite animes, but it is a strong contender for sure. The setting takes place in what can probably be best described as a city-state or a small, isolated country. At its center is an impossibly wide and deep hole that reaches into the earth, which houses deadly creatures and ancient technology. The city of Orth has been built around this chasm, with many of its residents living as explorers and adventurers of the abyss. One of the big gimmicks of the show is that anyone who delves deeper into this hole is afflicted by a mysterious curse, as if some atmospheric pressure is heavily weighing down on you. Interestingly enough, this isn't the entire world. There are countries elsewhere, and the planet seems like it's probably reasonably normal otherwise. It's just the abyss that's really messed up. And those who are drawn to it are willing to risk their lives in the pursuit of adventure. Riko is the main character, a student and aspiring adventurer at an orphanage. She's your typical loser student, dozing off and not paying attention in class, so she gets punished for it at times and... What the hell, Japan? She's a little girl! This show is so weird with how sexual it is. Riko is topless a little too often, and there's a running gag about looking at Reg's penis.
He has a belly button, but I couldn't really see inside his butt. I tried probing him with a stick, but it broke off inside. Ah! And his penis doesn't appear to be mechanical. It's more like a real one.
Okay, Riko, that'll be enough.
Yeah, sorry. We probably should have stopped her sooner.
Keep in mind that all these characters are supposed to be, like, 12? Anyway, Reg is the second main character. He's a surprisingly human-like yet extremely durable android who came from the depths of the abyss and has lost all his memories. He's discovered and restored by Riko and her friends, and the two quickly become close. The main story begins when an entourage of high-ranking adventurers return to the city of Orth with news that Riko's mother, a legendary adventurer in her own right, is most likely dead. Due to the culture of the city, this is seen as a moment of celebration, that such a great adventurer met with a noble end, and her explorations provided so much to the city and humanity as a whole. But Riko believes, despite the impossibilities, that her mother is still alive. Even though she is heavily discouraged and understands that her death is extremely likely, if not inevitable, Riko is still determined to delve as deep into the abyss as she can possibly go, and her new friend Reg feels compelled to protect her. Along the way, the two nearly lose their lives multiple times, but they also see incredible new sights and meet many strange people who have their own reasons for living in and exploring the abyss. The presentation is pretty solid, if not just straight up good. I like the detailed background art, and it doesn't clash with the characters and motion animations. Careful attention is given to color, lighting, and shadows as well. There's not a whole lot of action, but the animation is very fluid whenever necessary. Little details like characters stumbling as they run help goes a long way towards making the situation feel more immersive and believable. It's probably not the best animation I've ever seen, but I do think it's really good, especially for a TV show. One little issue I do have, however, is this very strange artistic effect on some of the monsters. I don't even know how to explain it, just look at it. It's an art style so unlike anything else in the show, and it clashes really badly, in my opinion. I guess it's supposed to show a contrast between the humans and the monsters, but it's not consistent. It's used randomly, even within the same scene. The effect isn't used often, but it stands out in a bad way when it is, and I just don't like it. The music and sound effects do the job well, heightening the tension when necessary. It's pretty good, and I'd say the soundtrack is worth listening to on its own. I mainly want to point out the opening and closing songs, which are cute, fun to listen to, and help emphasize the mood that the show is going for. It's all about cute little children going on a fun adventure and having a good time.
僕の右手をつないでつなげて始めよういつもそばにいるよ過去も今も未来も
Yeah, real fun times. Except when it's not. I'm not exactly sure what subgenre I would call this. I find it's often described as dark fantasy, which is accurate, sure, but there's a big difference between Made in Abyss and Dark Souls, for example. Both are dark fantasy, but both go for a drastically different approach. For lack of a better phrase, I prefer the term misleading horror. This kind of subgenre, usually dealing with little children living carefree lives and expressing a happy-go-lucky attitude, but they're also being put into horrific situations. I'd put this in a similar camp as games like Earthbound and Omori, or for something more directly appropriate as an anime, Madoka Magica. And I actually think that show makes for a pretty good comparison. Much in the same way that Madoka Magica is essentially a deconstruction of the magical girl anime genre, like Sailor Moon, Made in Abyss feels very much like a typical fantasy adventure. Look at Lunar the Silver Star, for example. It's about as cliche and stock of a fantasy story as you can get. You have our protagonist, Alex, who looks up to his long-dead hero, the legendary Dragon Master Dine. Despite the dangers and mild protests from those around him, Alex still ventures out into the world to follow a dream and desire that he can't keep satiated. Along the way, he meets with friends who will help him on his journey and wish him well as Dragon Master Dine's former allies, some of whom aren't necessarily amicable to Alex's journey and allude to a much darker past and sinister intentions. Made in Abyss is surprisingly very much along the same lines and tells a similar story. The typical fantasy trope of young adventurers braving the unknown in order to seek fame, fortune, or other personal reasons are all there. The way that Riko chases after her mother, who she barely knows at all, as well as how she idolizes the White Whistles, the most elite rank of adventurers in this world, is so cliche for a typical adventure story. On her journey, others explain to Riko that not everything is as glorious as it seems, which becomes a major plot point for her to develop as a person and bolster her own motivations.
Well, yeah, I'm aiming to be a White Whistle too someday.
Yes, how could I forget? You and Habo both. Of course, he's not as young anymore. Is being one really all that great?
Huh? Are you for real?
Of course, the difference in the case of Made in Abyss comes down to style and intention, offering an alternative perspective on a tried and true narrative. While it may seem ridiculous that children are employed to partake in somewhat organized but still very dangerous cave raidings, it almost feels like a sort of commentary to me. At the risk of sounding too pretentious, a secluded country that relies on children for dangerous and, at times, even inhumane work doesn't sound too far off from countries in real life where lax child labor laws and sweatshops are common. What I'm trying to say is, despite being such a fantastical and absurd setting, I actually found myself getting immersed in the world and believing in the struggles that the characters go through. And on top of everything else that's already so good, that might be the show's greatest strength: the characters and the writing. I really believe in these two, their struggles, their morals, their love for each other. They develop slowly across the arc of the show, and their personalities are relatable. Riko is strong-willed and very intelligent, but she's physically weak, and while she is prone to getting herself in danger, she's also a very resourceful survivalist who never gives up and is willing to do whatever it takes. Reg, on the other hand, is extremely powerful, but hesitant in the face of danger and far more cautious than his adventuring partner. It's often up to him to rely on Riko's teachings to keep the both of them alive, but the two ultimately rely on each other and care deeply for one another. I guess, in a way, this can loop back around to how oddly open the show is despite being about children. Because while they are children, the themes are heavy and the stakes are high. There's a lot of talk about existentialism, which is an obvious topic when slow and horrible deaths are around every corner, as well as discussions on self-sacrifice and humanity, but all the themes are handled maturely. And what's great is that the show never needs to spell any of this out. It all develops naturally. Up until episode 8, where it directly explains Riko and Reg's relationship up to that point. It's a very stupid and unnecessary moment, and it goes along with the usual lame storytelling cliches, like using flashbacks to re-explain stuff, or the occasional recap at the start of some episodes. These are minor though. For the most part, the writing is great. It's funny when it needs to be, it's often emotional but always appropriate, and I find the story to be quite engaging. While this is very much a character-driven story, it definitely helps that their adventure moves along at a pretty brisk pace. Even when there's moments where there isn't really anything happening, the dialogue is good and it's supported by the amazing locales. It has another writing cliche that's especially common in Japanese anime, where everything in the world needs to get over-explained. But in the case of Made in Abyss, I think it works out because the world is so intriguing and creative. I can't tell you how many times I've watched a movie or played a video game to review that I've fallen asleep in the middle of it, but I was enthralled by Made in Abyss. I was surprised that few of the scenes felt like they go on for too long, or that any particular part of the show felt like unnecessary filler, with the exception of the occasional recaps that could go on for a few minutes each. But I won't judge it too harshly considering that it's a TV show. Even despite that, it still gripped me from start to finish and only left me wanting more. One last thing I want to bring up, and this might be a weird complaint for most people, but Season 1 doesn't even end on a cliffhanger. It ends like mid-story arc, and rather abruptly. I mean, I get it, it's hard to adapt a comic and keep everything flowing well and under an appropriate budget, and to be fair, the season does end at a reasonable point of the story, but I would have been pissed if I had to watch this when it originally came out back in 2017, and I would have had to wait years for the continuation, which seems to have been carried on in a feature film, and just recently, finally, a second season. Some of my favorite anime, like Cowboy Bebop or High Score Girl, have a very defined beginning and end that took a year or two at most to finish putting it all out there. Even JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, another huge favorite of mine, is still written as a series of dedicated story arcs with defined beginnings and ends. I don't typically like shows that seem like they're designed to practically go on forever, and while I doubt that's going to be the case here, it is the typical thing for a serialized Japanese manga, and I can see Made in Abyss going down the same road. Overall, I think this is a really good anime, and I would definitely recommend it to most people. The only ones who I can see won't really get into this are those who find the concept to be far too ridiculous and they can't relate to little kids fighting off horrible monstrosities, which I can understand. I think the show does a really good job at explaining the situation and whatnot, but it still is highly fantastical all the same, so I suppose mileage can vary. You're also gonna have to deal with a fair bit of violence and gore. This anime has some shockingly uncomfortable stuff to it, but I feel like it's done less for shock value and more so to emphasize how dangerous the world really is. Everything comes together so well. I found the characters to be believable, the setting is creative and unique, and the story hooks you in. The voice acting is also pretty top-notch, especially for the two main characters. They really poured their whole emotions out on this. Maybe the whole curse of the abyss is a bit too gimmicky, but it does a good job at elevating the stakes in the world. It's important for the story that this is a one-way trip for Riko, whether she makes it to the bottom of the abyss or not. I'm afraid of this show, and the original manga for that matter, being designed to essentially go on forever. And considering that it's been slowly trudging along since as early as 2013, I don't think that's too far-fetched of a fear to have. For this first season specifically, I feel like if the episode count, some of the pacing and key moments, and just some select few irks I had were all managed a little bit better, then I can almost see this as being near perfect. Regardless, I still do think that this is well worth checking out. Thanks for watching my review on Season 1 of Made in Abyss.